Italy was a young state at the dawn of the 20th century, reborn in 1861, 1400 years after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Born out of the fires of popular revolution and a Franco-Austrian rivalry, it would soon become clear that the tumult that accompanied the kingdom's birth foreshadowed the chaos that would bring about its destruction only 80 years later. Italy's delayed unification brought with it a multitude of problems, which the government of the new state would endeavor to address over the coming decades. One of the most glaring issues facing Italy, at least in the eyes of the ruling classes, was the nation's lack of prestige compared to its fellow European states. This insecurity resulted in two conflicts that sought to bolster Italian prestige. The first of these came in 1895, when Italian colonial ambitions brought them into conflict with the East African state of Ethiopia. Under the hawkish leadership of Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, Italian forces annexed a portion of Ethiopian territory, which resulted in the outbreak of the First Italo-Ethiopian War. This conflict would become a black stain on the young nation's record, as Italian forces were rapidly overwhelmed by the Ethiopian military and forced to accept defeat in 1896. It would take another 15 years before Italy tried its hand at colonialism again. In the interim, the Kingdom of Italy, along with the rest of Europe, saw a period of immense economic and industrial growth from 1900 to 1907. This period saw the birth of famous Italian companies, some of which still live on to this day, like Fiat, Lancia, and Alfa Romeo. Despite the prospering economy, little of that wealth and good fortune reached the masses, leaving the poor of Italy discontent with their government. The process of industrialization further exacerbated this problem, as continued development of the already partially industrialized north left the largely agrarian south of the country a backwater, and one in which poverty and diseases like malaria were pervasive. While steps were taken by the government to combat these problems, such as the development and distribution of the anti-malarial drug quinine, they were overshadowed by the sheer immensity of the problems facing the lower classes. Social discontent breeds political action, and as these issues persisted, the Italian Socialist Party and the newly formed Italian People's Party experienced a boom in membership. For years, the liberal and conservative status quo managed to retain their power over the government, but the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 and the entrance of Italy into the conflict in 1915 would prove too much for the ruling class's bulwark to bear. During this period of global conflict, an Italian socialist and journalist would come to play a major role in Allied efforts to pull Italy into the war. This man was named Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini. Mussolini had been an active member of the Italian Socialist Party, PSI, for most of his life, and by 1914 was a major figure within the organization, working as editor for the party newspaper, the Avanti. The PSI's stance on war grew against the grain, as unlike practically every other socialist party in Europe, Italian socialists were opposed to intervention. The socialist parties of Europe believed that the horrors and devastation of the war would bring about a popular revolution across the continent, resulting in the upheaval of the old systems and the creation of new socialist states. In early 1914, Mussolini was still towing the party line, but by the end of the year had converted to interventionism. By taking a hard line against the party orthodoxy, Mussolini was alienating himself from the majority of his fellow socialists, which resulted in his expulsion from the party and his editor's position at the Avanti in late 1914. Undeterred, Mussolini began circulating his own paper, Il Popolo d'Italia, where he preached the virtues of war and the benefits it would have for the working classes. This marks an important development in Mussolini's ideology, as the exaltation of war would become a dominant characteristic of the Italian fascist and German National Socialist doctrines. Italy entered the First World War on the 24th of May, 1915, after a period of fierce debate and social upheaval both for and against intervention. The Treaty of London, which solidified Italy's new alliance with the Entente, promised the kingdom territorial acquisitions that the state had been eyeing since its formation. These included Trent, Tyrol, Trieste, Istria, Gorizia, and a sizable portion of Dalmatia. Over the next 3 years, Italy's northern border with Austria-Hungary became a mountainous killing field, in which roughly 1.7 million Italian men were slaughtered, brutally wounded, or taken prisoner. Accompanying the war casualties were another 2.4 million men, women, and children who died as a result of the Spanish flu. The unprecedented destruction brought about as a consequence of the war and the disruption of international trade soon resulted in the economic crash of the 1920s, only worsening the already wretched state of European affairs. The conclusion of the war did nothing to ease internal tensions within Italy. The lower and middle classes now clamored for a reward for all the blood, sweat, and tears they had contributed to the fighting. The ruling elite, sensing the danger this popular reformist sentiment posed to them, did everything in their power to put the genie of popular demands back in the bottle. They largely failed to achieve this goal. A surge in membership within the Italian Socialist Party coincided with the birth of organized fascism in Milan. Between 1919 to 1920, the PSI managed to gain a stranglehold over the government, winning 156 of the 508 seats in parliament, becoming by far the largest and most influential political party in the country. Simultaneously, new fasci began to emerge across the peninsula. By the end of 1920, there existed 88 local fascist organizations boasting over 20,000 members. Within a year, fascist popularity skyrocketed, totaling 835 fasci and 250,000 active members by December 1921. The socialists squandered their power, spending much of 1919 bickering over how to best bring about their utopia rather than actually doing so. By mid-1920, the liberals had regained control of the government under the leadership of Giovanni Giolitti. While the socialists may not have capitalized on their time in the spotlight, the fascists were doing everything in their power to muscle their way into political relevance. Fascist squads utilized brutal paramilitary tactics to break up strikes, harass and murder socialist activists and leaders, and establish fascist unions that were loyal to the party and generally favorable to the industrialists who they worked for. These actions ingratiated the fascist party to many within the factory-owning class, earning them a much-needed source of funding. Their popular support, however, came from the middle class, which for decades had felt alienated from the mainstream of Italian politics. The middle class was vehemently opposed to socialism, but also saw no real benefit in voting for the liberal status quo. The Italian government had done little to help the middle class grow in any meaningful way, and failed to adopt many of the nationalist policies that had become popular with them after the war. As a consequence, they sought out political representation in a new political movement, fascism. During the 1921 elections, seeing defeat as a very real possibility, the incumbent, Giovanni Giolitti, shored up his chances of winning by extending an offer to the fascists to form a coalition. The Fasci di Combattimento, now rebranded as the Partito Nazionale Fascista, performed better than any other party within the coalition, earning 36 of the 120 seats won. Over the next year, the legitimacy of the liberal state, which had already lost much of its power, practically disintegrated, not in small part thanks to the activism of fascist thugs. In October 1922, secret plans were made between the elites in the fascist party to orchestrate a coup against the government. Mussolini was well aware that the Italian army was more loyal to him and the movement than to their employers, and was confident in their ability to force a new government into power. Beginning on the morning of the 28th of October, 3 columns of fascist paramilitaries marched on Rome in an act of political hubris that would later be mimicked by Adolf Hitler in his failed Beer Hall Putsch. Unlike that later insurrection, Mussolini would not fail to take power. After a chaotic and jumbled response by King Victor Emmanuel III, the government resigned, a new one was formed, and the next day, Mussolini was named Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Italy. The fascist age had begun.